Okay, so welcome to the third webinar in our series, 7-part series. This webinar is titled Strategies for Tackling Mental Health in Adults and Children. And just as a disclaimer for all of our sessions, the views of external speakers are solely theirs, and they don't represent the views of Knowledge to Action. As I've mentioned, I'm your host, Waqas, and this is part of a webinar series which is brought to you by Ilm to Amal and Islamic Relief. Many of you don't need an introduction to what we do here at Ilm to Amal. I think many of you have either seen our resources or you've been to our retreats or a training program. But for those who haven't, it's just an introduction here that we're specialists in character development and life skills education. You can find more about what we do on social media at Ilm to Amal and our website if you want to check out some of the resources that we produce. Those of you who mentioned or have asked for a recap, I usually do a recap because there's 7 parts and they're all interconnected as part of a wider narrative of looking at change in the changing world and how we're trying to develop children who can become change makers, inshallah, tomorrow. So what are the key burning issues? And this is webinar 3. Webinar 2 was looking at the identity crisis amongst young people, and we were doing that with guest speakers from Here for Youth and Islamic Network, who are also conducting research into young people. And this was sort of a synopsis. If you can take here just a couple of seconds, 60 seconds on this. If you missed the last webinar, inshallah, there will be a recording. In fact, if you missed the last 2 webinars, there will be recordings available. We're just editing them at the moment. And along with, like I mentioned, a suite of resources, i.e. PDFs, shorter sort of bite-sized videos for social media that will summarize each session up. So here we looked at in session 2, which was a fantastic session, real good turnout. Lots more people, 4 times as much people. I think there were like 400 people who wanted to attend the webinar, but they couldn't, unfortunately, because it was during midweek and due to Ramadan. That's the only window we had for that. And so we looked at identity crisis from the root causes, lack of sense of purpose, sense of belonging, sense of responsibility. And we looked at the difference between what symptoms look like, you know, maybe in gender inequality, poor mental health, poor academic performance, absenteeism at work, productivity. There's loads of things, but these are the symptoms versus root causes. And we looked at the difference between boys and girls and what identity crisis means to each one based on the research. There was perspectives from, identity crisis at home, school, madrasa, and the key point there was about mental health crisis being at the heart of it. We also touched upon the need for specialist intervention, services required inside and outside of institutes like the masjids and the youth clubs and the madrasas. And again, the focus was on mental health, which brings us on nicely as a follow-on to this episode on mental health. It's a key part. If you can't talk about identity, if you don't look at the well-being of people, and you cannot resolve the crisis in our young people today if we don't put mental health at the heart of the debate or the discourse. And of course, that's not the only thing. There was other tools like emotional intelligence that we need to nurture both in ourselves and also in our children. And last but not least, the emphasis fell on the need for conversations in a safe, open, non-judgmental way. And in the classroom, that is called dialogical learning. It's a specialist type of, it's a method of education which is non-linear, I guess, and it's not your typical curriculum style. So that was the recap of webinar 2. We'll be coming on to that with the recording, hopefully, and you should get that. If you registered, you'll get that suite of resources sent to you, inshallah. As I mentioned, this is a 7-part series. Again, for those of you who are tuning in, for the 3rd time, you'll be familiar with this framework that we're following throughout Ramadan. Well, actually, the next week, we've only got a few more sessions left. And those of you joining for the first time, we started with rethinking education for a changing world. We moved on to the identity crisis, which was a spiritual moral development. Today's session is part of the mental well-being or the mental health and well-being module. Sorry, that's the wrong title that I've got. Unfortunately, it's the wrong title. It was a title before, but we've broadened that out to tackling mental health in adults and children, but stress and anxiety will come up, no doubt. And then the next session, which is actually tomorrow, which is actually connected to this mental health and emotional well-being, We're looking at personality types and love languages, and that'll be a cracking session too, about you, yourself, your child, and even your spouse, which are going to be quite key for the emotional well-being of your family. And then there's other modules which we'll touch upon towards the end. Now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. We've already heard from her. Her name is Khalida Haq, and she's a psychotherapist, Mind in the City, which many people would have heard of. 15 years of experience, mashallah, she brings to the table or the webinar here in areas of mental health, well-being and therapy, mashallah. She's a qualified, registered and experienced counselor. She wears many hijabs, I must say, mashallah. She's a clinical service manager for the city, Mining City in Hackney and Waltham Forest. It's a big area. Safeguarding lead and counseling consultant for Noor DV. That sounds very interesting. And she has been formerly a counseling service manager for Tower Hamlets. And for me, one of the reasons why Khalida stuck out to me to invite to this particular webinar is that the spectrum of counselors and their focus is very, very broad, and they're like every other field, they've got to be specialists. And because we're talking about adults and children here, it's not common, I guess, in my experience, to find counselors who have experience of both. They either specialize in one or the other, and there's very few who look at both. And I think what Khalida brings here is that her experience from the Tower Hamlets role that she had, where she was a schools counseling, for the schools counseling partnership, that will be very interesting for us to see about the mental health in children. But of course, this ultimately is about you as the mum, dad, the teacher, the youth worker, the adult in the life of those children. And you're, like we said in the first webinar, the tarbiyah of the adult precedes the tarbiyah of children. And we'll get into that shortly. She's also the co-host of something which sounds really, really exciting. And I think it's something that, if this is for women, then I would love to send my wife to. If it's for both sexes or genders, I would love to attend myself. The Big Reconnect Sleepover, which Khalida can tell us a bit more about as we go into.
I can tell you, yes, it is for sisters, and it is very much about retreating and being able to spend time in the company of other sisters and reconnecting with yourself, connecting with the sisterhood, inshallah, and reconnecting with our sustainer. That's the tagline for it.
Love it. Beautiful. Fantastic. And it sounds really good, inshallah. We'll learn more about that towards the end of this webinar, inshallah. So very, very quickly, guys, we can get into our topic. Okay, this is not a presentation where the guest speaker speaks and you just listen and take notes and we say goodbye to you at the end. It is actually a cross between a presentation and a podcast, a live podcast. So it's an interactive conversation. We'll do it in 4 parts. A little bit from myself, a little bit from our guest speaker, and then let's have lots of questions from you, because really, ultimately, this is going to be driven by you and your questions. And the idea behind this is to create a platform where we can create accessibility for our community to access people with, the experts and the professionals, which we, mashallah, have in Sister Khalida here. So first part we'll start off with is, let's actually stop for a second and define mental health, because what is mental health and what isn't mental health, or what is a mental health problem and not a mental health problem? So let's kind of like unpack that. I think that's really important to start there with a bit of an introduction. What I'd really like to get into heart of is the crisis that we hear about taking place, not only just in children, but also in the parents. So what are the burning issues with families, I guess, within families? Part 3, inshallah, will be the bulk of the conversation. And again, I really hope you are interacting with us and sending questions in the chat section. Let's look at managing mental health better and more nuanced in light of what we know and the strategies that we're aware of and the key recommendations. So these are questions to your, I guess, solutions to your dilemmas. So please do send in your questions in the Q&A or comments in the chat section, inshallah. And last but not least, we will try to focus on signposting, I guess, where we want to go or where we can go from here, and what do we need to do? And I guess the key, if you follow Ilm Trammell, you'll know we're very much about practical learning to practice, and usually that is through practice, experiential. Hopefully you should be able to take some points away from this webinar that you can implement very easily at home, or you might get a realization of a lot of things you need to learn. Perhaps, if you're like me, there's lots of things you need to unlearn. And very quickly, ground rules, you're veterans to this. Let's put the questions in the chat box, Q&A box, and any comments you want. Please keep them concise as best as possible. Relevant would be very helpful. And if you do want to speak, please raise your hand. By all means, I'd let you in, inshallah, and you can have a one-to-one with the speakers, inshallah. Okay, so let me start off, Sister Khalda, and just get the ball rolling. So let's hear from you. Just before I do that, when I was looking into this research about how to rethink about education and tarbiyah I was going to say post-COVID, but the lockdown.
Still in it.
We're still in it, absolutely. We're living with it, and it'll be a while before we possibly get out of it, if we do ever get out of it. I mean, it's taken hundreds of years for the other sort of viruses and other viruses and sort of pandemics to the impact of that is still carrying on today, I guess. So since the pandemic began, 8 out of every 10 parents feel that their child or the children are experiencing heightened stress and anxiety levels. School leaders that I personally know in my network, because I deal with the schools and the madrasas, they're witnessing a crisis in mental health with alarming levels of school inclusions and behavioral issues amongst teenagers, particularly teenagers, okay? And it's not just teenagers, it's also in preteens. Now, you got to ask yourself this question that for many, this will simply be the tip of the iceberg, and how bad can it really get? And this is all backed by research that's been pulled off the government papers. Almost half of secondary schools, 46% in particular, to be precise, said their pupils' mental and emotional health was actually the biggest challenge in helping them catch up with learning. So forget about, the few extra hours that you need to put in to catch up with the months that we've lost. And if you remember from the first webinar, study in Boston in America was that they predicted that for reading literacy, it was 3 months. And for maths, numeracy, it was 12 months. And that's just in terms of the days lost, not in terms of, the real value of that time and that opportunity at that particular point. So,
I would just add here, if that's okay,
yeah.
From my own experience and anecdotally, that's also what I've seen. So I was still working at Tower Hamlets at that time when the pandemic kicked off and the first lockdowns occurred. It's only recently that I've stopped that role, but certainly across, so school leaders were experiencing very much themselves the crisis in terms of their being able to manage their own mental health and well-being, as well as managing the whole schools. So just to let you know anecdotally that's that there's the evidence to support all of this.
Brilliant. And 8 out of 10 parents, I mean, on one hand, it's not shocking because those who are parents will understand what we've just been through was unprecedented and difficult, especially if you're, again, there's research done into this with working parents and parents who are unemployed, and the mental health crisis is still the same. There's still a crisis, but it's different. And so it shouldn't come as a shock, but it's still quite high. And that's pretty much nearly every parent. It'll be interesting to see the 2 out of the 10 that, didn't feel that or see that. And maybe, there's more research required there. This is a nice way to sum it up, that why is our tarbiyah important, or our understanding of this issue important? Well, we can't really pour from an empty vessel. And the question we would like to ask at Jamal, as an overall question to the webinar, is how much of the heightened stress and anxiety that is felt by our children is actually caused by the deteriorating mental health we, as the adults, whether you're a parent at home or the teachers in the classroom, it's a knock-on effect. So that brings me nicely to hand over to Sister Khalida, inshallah. Part 1 of the 4 that we've got is, well, what is mental health and what isn't? What is mental health? What is a mental health illness and what isn't a mental health illness? Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So if we go on to the next screen.
My daughter loves dogs, and she would be very happy at home to see this.
Okay, so just a quote here to help you, those of you who may not have experienced a mental illness, just to understand that the only thing more exhausting than having a mental illness is pretending like you don't. We often see that. So just to say that, just
Mm.
as a starter to
Mhm.
what we're going to talk about. If we go on to the next screen as well, that would be really useful. Oh, the one after.
So yeah,
oh,
that's fine. That one?
oh, is this one?
Yes.
No, there was the one that you've got. Oh, that's the next one. Sorry.
Is it this
After
one?
this, carry on, carry on. The one
This one, yeah.
after. That's
This
it.
one, yeah.
Okay,
All right.
great.
Sorry.
Because this is perfect actually, because it actually fits in with very much the definition by the World Health Organization of what mental health is. And it's not just the absence of mental illness. It's actually defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes their own potential. So therapy is very much in this, and can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So that's the World Health Organization's definition of what mental health is. And as you can see here, something around the differences between what happens when we're in mental health and what happens when we're in a mental illness. And one of the ways that I like to think about things generally and across the board, including mental health, is on a spectrum.
Okay.
Right. And one of the ways of also looking at this is in a quadrant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we think of it as, I don't know if those of you who know Johari's window, but if you've got the sort of cross-sectioning vertical line, horizontal line.
Yeah.
So, but if we just think of health on one end and illness on the other.
Okay.
And what I mean by that, and why I'm saying this, is that I think it's really important to see that we might be in mental health, but we can go into mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And even though we're in mental illness, and this is one of the assumptions that are made around and sort of misconceptions around mental illness, is that we can recover, we can get well. And one of the misconceptions is that we can't recover from mental illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really important
So that's the good news, yes.
understand. Yeah, that's the good news. And sometimes actually, if we're not sort of aware of what's going on within us, we're actually in a worse place than actually knowing that we have a mental illness and dealing with it. So that would be in the lower quadrant of the sort of right-hand side of the box. Mm-hmm. So if we think of the left-hand side of the, it would have been really good to draw this and have flip charts and things, but just thinking of it as sort of that we can recover. But I guess it's harder, and if we don't take recognition and accept that we might be in a mental illness or somebody might be having an episode of some sort, then we can't work on it. Whereas I guess if you get a diagnosis, and I'm not sort of one for labels and things, but it helps to sometimes to know what it is that we have so that we can know where to go to in terms of support and how to get that support.
Yes. Are you putting health on the left-hand side of your diagram and illness on the right?
Yeah.
That's the spectrum,
yeah. And that's my spectrum. So,
okay. Brilliant.
So just recognizing that we can move up and down along that. We can be in great health and something can happen, which moves us into illness and unwellness. And as you can see, I'm not going to sort of read the boxes, but you can, oh, yes, very good.
There you go. I don't know if
it's a bit blurry, but
sorry.
I think we've
right.
got the,
yeah,
got the gist of it.
That's my background, unfortunately, because I've got my son said to me before this video started, he said, Dad, don't blur your background because, you know, you probably end knowing you probably end up doing a visual and holding something.
That's it. Great. Yeah. Right. Thank you very much for that.
Right. So there we go.
Okay.
All right. I mean, just on that point, folks, some of you will want, I know that there'll be lots of questions about these diagrams and references. Just very quickly, once this webinar has been recorded and delivered, there will be a webtorial, so a short webtorial with the visual aids and the recommended resources with the signposting of the correct links and addresses that will be sent out to you after this. So don't worry if you're not going to capture it right now. Sorry, Sister Carla, you were saying?
That's okay. I don't think I've ever heard of a webtorial, but wonderful. So as you can see from the diagram though, so when we're in health, we're able to be productive, do productive things, have fulfilling relationships, and the ability to manage and cope. Whereas when we're in illness, we're less able to think and manage our own emotions, behaviors, and we also are more likely to be in distress and having trouble functioning in the day-to-day and generally.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd just like to talk a little bit about some common misconceptions. So one of the things I mentioned was that there's no recovery from mental illness. There is
That's
absolutely,
a big,
that's a huge misconception, and very much we can heal from it. It's about recognizing that we're in it, just as we would if we had COVID,
yeah,
or a cold, or a flu, or
yeah.
anything else that's physical, even diabetes, say. So if we think of mental illness such as bipolar
Mm-hmm.
disorder
Mm-hmm.
as diabetes, right? You know, you've got diabetes. So what are you supposed to avoid? What are you supposed to do? What to look after yourself? Similarly, if you do those things knowing around bipolar, then you should generally stay in good health.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so with diabetes, right, it won't get worse if you don't eat too much sugar and you follow the diet rules. So thinking of it like that, and I like to think of mental health as an aspect of the whole. It's and not sort of separating ourselves out into different parts of mind, body, soul. We're all, it all impacts.
Interconnected, yeah.
Yeah, and it's all interconnected. So it's really important to think of it that way. But sorry, that's an aside. I'm going away from the topic. Mental illness is rare. That's a misconception.
Okay.
It's very common. Anxiety and stress is very common. Everybody experiences stress and anxiety. But it's when does it become a mental illness? When does it become a difficulty? Well, when does it become something that needs addressing? And it's 1 in 4 is the pre-pandemic. That is, it was 1 in 4 of us would at some point in our lives experience a mental health
illness,
mental illness, a mental disorder of some kind. Yeah.
Right. And after COVID?
After COVID, I'm afraid I'm not quite clear, but you've got that 8
we
out of 10 parents.
so
I think it's probably double, triple, quadruple, possibly even that now. But it's increased certainly, and it is around the factors around us. We have to recognize that it's not just what's going on internally. The external world has an impact on how we respond and react to things, and so it can increase. So just similarly with, there's the pandemic of COVID. We are seeing somewhat of the pandemic of mental health post that, and for various reasons.
There's a question here. It's actually more of a chat. Could I be signposted? So there's a sister, mashallah, I know from East London. Assalamu alaikum. So there's a sister who's asking that in Hackney, London, my spouse, myself, and my children suffer from different types of mental health and require support. I mean, where does somebody really go for something like this in the communities?
Okay, so first of all, I guess if you're in Hackney, then for the adults, certainly at Mind, we have something called the Wellbeing Network where you can self-refer. And if you're, so we're having to prioritize certain categories of people because there's so many referrals. And very much our communities would be amongst them, because one of the aspects of the community that is being prioritized is those of, and I don't like to use the term BAME, but that's the term that we probably understand, but minoritized communities are seen as sort of more of a priority because they're not having as much access to services as their white counterparts. So you can refer, if you're in Hackney, a resident of Hackney or the city, to the Wellbeing Network. And then with children, it's a broader thing, and it depends on what the needs are. But first port of call I would suggest is the schools, and talking to the schools and seeing if they've got any space in their counselling service, if they have a counselling service, or if there's when I was working, we had a drop-in service for the children as well as the adults, and that's something, if that's there at the school, encouraging the children to jot it in on a slip and go and see the counsellor for a drop-in, and then they might take it from there and get some more support. But that would be a first step, I would suggest.
Interesting. Thank you to the sister for putting that question early on. I just thought I'll bring this in here now because I can see this being a common question for a lot of people, but we will delve more into that, I guess, in terms of how to manage it and where to go towards the end of this presentation. So this slide,
absolutely.
you're good to move on from the slide, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to mention some more, but I think I'll just skip to the last misconception, really, which is it's a sign of weakness. Having a mental illness.
I've taken three. Sorry to recap. I've taken three misconceptions. And one was that, well, the fixed, what we call the fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, which is you don't think you could heal from it, and something that you'll never recover from. The second one you mentioned was, sorry, I noted three. Maybe there's more. Maybe you could.
Okay, that's, I'll carry on then. If we've got the time, are we
okay
no,
time-wise? Okay,
okay.
So there's a misconception, which is that it's very rare. And,
so the next one is that it means that we're not going to be able to function.
Okay.
So if we have mental illness, we won't function. But if we think of it, as a spectrum, I just hit my microphone there. Don't know if you heard that reverberate, but if we think of that line, if we're not, if we're in mental illness but not fully sort of having say a psychotic episode, perhaps, then we will still be functioning. We are. It is possible to function, and there are many people who are functioning, and we don't know it. Just as it said earlier, a part of the exhaustion of having a mental illness is pretending like you don't have one, and there are so many of us who are doing that, so they are able to function.
Okay. Brilliant. Yeah.
The other one is another one is mentally ill. The mentally ill are violent and unpredictable.
Okay.
And that's really not the case. I mean, it's if somebody is going to be violent, that's something that's underlying there anyway. It's more to do, not so much to do with the mental illness. Yeah, it's more to do with their characteristics and their reactions and their trauma reactions, and and the way that they've learned to manage and cope with feelings and emotions. And sometimes that's what they've learned, that violence is the way, but it's not because they're mentally ill that they're violent.
Okay.
Another misconception is that mental health disorders are genetic.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I've heard that one.
Yep. And actually they're not. And then there's whole, it may be that grandmother was depressed, mother is depressed, child is then depressed. But is that more around the environment in which an individual has grown up rather than genetics? Because genetically they haven't found any link when they've done all the sort of DNA sort of testing and things.
There's another one which is quite common, and I guess it's an age-old one, and many of us have heard this before, but many of us also have heard, us coming out of this sort of ignorance. As you mentioned genetics, I thought of genetics. So basically, it's not funny because I've seen this within my own family. I've seen it also within my friend circles. I've been to a number of talks over the years. Some really big scholars that I really hold in high esteem. 10 years ago, mental illness was seen something that you were possessed with, and even today, some people still hold that view. Although the scholars that I follow that were holding that that view 10 years ago no longer hold that view anymore, and many of them have retracted their statements and apologize. So yeah, is it something that's outside of my control in terms of a jinn?
Well, let me just bring in the word majnoon. Well, that means being possessed, right? And does it have to be a jinn that possesses us? If you think about what we're like when we're anger, and the anger overtakes, it's in possession, right, of ourselves. So it's a big topic. I'm not sure we're going to be able to unpack it fully here, but I guess thinking about what does it mean to be possessed, and who is doing the possessing. And one of the things we do know is that Shaitan is only able to whisper. He's not able to take control of us. And so just thinking around that, and as you say, that the scholars have moved away more from talking about jinn possession and mental health, or rather mental illnesses being around jinn. And obviously we know that there's shifa in the Quran, there's shifa in practicing, in terms of salah and fasting and all the rest of it. We know that there's healing in that. But what's important is to recognize that just as there's a cure for everything, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes the cure is not solely in the Quran and in terms of practice, Islamic practice. And you can't see me, I realize, because I've don't have a camera and I'm doing like quotation marks, but I hope that's clear in the way that I'm saying things. That's what I mean in terms of quotation.
Sorry, Sister Khalda, to interrupt.
Right.
I just had a really important question, which is connected
Sure.
to this, and actually one that's more, I guess, more common than the jinn is, well, what about the weakness of Iman? Because a lot of people, I've said this to me, my wife. I'll just give you a little bit of a background. When my first child was born, I remember my wife at that time was suffering from postnatal depression, and I didn't know. It's my first one, I've ever been through it. And you know, it was difficult. I'm sharing this because it's probably a common story out there for couples and for lots of sisters. And I remember turning to some close people of mine who were like my mentors at the time. Still my mentors today. I've not fallen out over this, but I remember that this is going back to 2010. And I remember at that time, people around me saying, well, you need to really give some dawah to his wife and build her iman, because it's all whispers and it's all weakness of iman that she's going through this condition. And there was no, I didn't know it was postnatal depression. I know a lot about it now. My wife wasn't able to explain to me what it was at the time. And certainly the people that I was going to as my mentors, and many of them were blokes, men, you know, brothers, seniors to me, who've had children of their own. And they were at that time that's my first ever introduction to this notion that mental health or depression or anxiety, you know, other things connected to mental health, forms of mental health or mental illness, which postnatal depression isn't. You know, it's basically they're connected to your weakness of your man. And so, yeah, what's a little bit more about that for the sister?
Well, it's great that you've brought that up, because that is one of the common misconceptions. Not so much the iman bit, but just generally that having a mental illness is a sign of weakness. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I've extended that in sort of my thinking is that, you know, because we do hear that bad mental health or illnesses means low iman. And I guess I would refer us to the stories of the prophets and the prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah, he experienced sorrow, he experienced anxiety, he experienced difficult times, and there were times where he thought he was forsaken by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if that were a case that low iman didn't sort of and again, I guess I'm just wary of like people feeling that I'm sort of not recognizing that the prophets are a separate, you know, they're perfect in the way that they are and things. However, they're also an example for us to learn from. And I believe that their experiences of sorrow, grief, etc., are ways for us to learn how to manage these things. I don't think it's about low iman. I think it can be a sign. I'm not saying that it can't be a sign that we might be having low iman, but only we can decide that. I think only we know. So I know for myself what I'm experiencing. So if I'm experiencing real pain, real difficulty, and I'm trying hard not to act on that in terms of suicidality and sort of doing things to harm myself, how is that low iman?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, folks who are on our chat, our attendees, you were a bit quiet today compared to the previous webinar. So what do you guys think? What's your comments? Share your comments with us and let us know what you think about these issues around what is mental health, what isn't. What, I mean, your own experiences, what do you think? Have you experienced what we're talking about in terms of some of the misconceptions? We'd love to hear from you. Shall we move on to Stakhalda to?
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, there's a lot to get through actually still. Okay.
Okay, I just I guess just here before we move on, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I just wanted to talk about the why that we might experience mental illnesses, and it's really, I think as Muslims, it's reminding ourselves that we are created in kabad. In Surah Al-Balad, we'll see in Ayah 4. We have certainly created man into hardships. So that's part of our existence. And very much if we believe that this is dunya, this is a time of testing to, you know, decide which of us gets to Jannah and which of us doesn't, then we know that it's going to be, there's going to be trials and there's going to be testings. And if those before us were tested, why would we not be tested? And the other one to remind us of is that to be sure that we shall test you with something of fear and hunger, some loss in goods or lives, or the fruits of your toil, but give glad tidings to those who patiently persevere. And that's Al-Baqarah 155. And just going back to the Iman question, not Imam, good slip there. Iman question. Isn't, if somebody, as I said, is really working hard within themselves despite the immense amount of pain that they're feeling psychically, not to hurt themselves, are they not patiently persevering?
Well, yeah. Okay. There is a couple of questions come here now. Are there different types of mental health problems?
Are there different types of mental health problems? There
Yes.
are different types of mental health problems, and usually they're sort of linked to stress and anxiety, and the other one is depression. But a lot of it is moving away from truth, in the sense that we need to protect ourselves from what is happening, the reality. So when I say truth, that's the reality of what is happening and surviving that. So often it's around survival. And then what happens is that we continue to use those mechanisms as we grow. However, those prevent us then from actually seeing the reality of the current sometimes. And so I think it's really important to recognize that at the time it might have been useful. And then when we're moving, as we grow and we go into other relationships, we react in the same ways as we did previously. We use those, and it's about protection. And what we need is connection. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
But and I really don't like labeling. One of the things is like thinking of things as sort of personality disorder. There's all these labels, and I guess there's the DSM in terms of that. But people are moving away from pathologizing. In terms of the medical model, it is being moved away from and being seen more as a holistic thing. And I think what's most important is understanding individually what is going on for that person. So it may be depression, but it's that person's depression.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it's working with them and helping them understand the roots, what's created the depression, what's it come from, where it's it come from, what are the stresses that might be needing to be moved away, and so on and so forth. But it's a huge topic, to be honest.
Of course.
I was going to move on to talk about stress and anxiety.
Yeah, sure. So
if that's okay.
I think so. We've got lots of questions coming in, which is great. So what we'll do is I'll bring them in after your. I won't disrupt you on this slide here. So you're on stress and anxiety, which was this one. I'll just come back at one or two for you. Is this the one?
Yeah, this is the one. So stress and anxiety. So I think the important thing I've just put this up here because one of the things is if you're referred to the NHS, you'll tend to be going to IAPT, which is improving access to psychological therapies. Okay. And there they deliver a modality of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. There's lots of interesting things about that because we know now that more than 1,000 years ago, this was actually developed by our own shiur. Al-Balkhi in particular did a lot of work on this. So, but I don't want to go too far aside, but here, this quote is about the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. And I think thinking about actually free will, we do have choice. We sometimes don't feel like we have choice, but we do have choice. And I guess the thing that affects the choice or the feelings of not being in control is stress. And stress is, might have put it as, how we react when we feel under pressure or threatened. It usually happens when we're in a situation where we don't feel like we can manage or control. So I'd just like us to think about the word stress. Actually, some stress is good for us. It's actually useful. It motivates us. It helps give us that little bit of a push to get on with the daily as well as the work. If you didn't have that little bit of push behind you in terms of stress, if we think of stress as stimulus, then it's useful. However, it can get to a point where it overwhelms and it's too much stress. and then it's difficult to manage. Yeah, and then what happens is the brain gets flooded, and we go into anxiety. And so anxiety is what we feel. So we feel worried, tense, and afraid. And that's the response to stress. Yeah, and when it's too much, usually, or it feels like too much. So even low amounts of stress to one person may feel like a lot of stress to somebody else. And that's to do with how we are able. So in terms of, if we think about it as we have a stress container, we are a stress container. So think of a bucket, if you like. Some people have mugs. Some people have Balti's buckets. Yeah. Some people have bathtubs.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're all, and at different times, we have different capacities. And what's important is to recognize that as with the stress bucket, it can be at a certain level and we'll be doing fine. But if it reaches sort of to the top of the bucket or the mug or the bathtub, it will start overflowing. And what you'll recognize for yourself is signs that it's getting too much. So your sleep might be going out of whack. You might not be sleeping so well. You might be irritable. You might be doing a bit more shouting than usual at the kids. Yeah. So that would tell you. And so what's important for our everyday and to manage one of the ways of managing our mental health is to recognize and understand what is our signs that we're getting overly stressed. So the bucket is no longer, or the mug or whatever container we have is no longer able to contain. And so we need to have and insert on the side of our containers self-care. So you mentioned self-care earlier.
Yeah.
And I will mention it again later, but it's the whole thing about the oxygen mask. If we really don't put the oxygen mask on ourselves, the whole reason we have to put it on ourselves is because if we're passed out, we're not going to be able to put it on the children or anybody else that needs us to support them.
So we've all been on an aeroplane. I think most of us have been on an aeroplane, and you know that when you're taking these safety measures are being read out to put the mask on yourself first before you put the mask on to others, and that's because you won't survive. If you don't take care of yourself first, you can't help others. There's two questions raised there, two hands raised, and I think the attendees will be doing this if they think it's relevant to this section. So am I okay to interject there and bring
Absolutely.
in? I'll start with Sister Khalda first, only because your names come up first, and then Nazneen Bari will come to you, inshallah. So I'm just going to, if you unmute yourself, another Khalida Hussain. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Could you please unmute yourself? Khalida Hussain, you've got your hand raised. Okay, maybe not. And the other one has also disappeared. So carry on, Sister Khalida.
Okay, so going back to anxiety. So anxiety is really a natural human response. Yeah, and it occurs when we feel under threat. And it can be experienced through our thoughts. So that's why very much, it's the ability to, that's why it's the greatest weapon, to be able to choose one thought over another. Feelings and physical sensations. And so they all interact and they're all sort of going around, and you can, automatic. Our thoughts are so automatic. We can't catch up with them a lot of the time. It's just happening. And the first thing we know about it is the sensation in our stomach, perhaps, or we're feeling sick. We're about to deliver a webinar and we're running to the loo, right?
well, funny you say, it's funny, sorry to interrupt there, but funny you say that. I was just about to leave the house. My 7-year-old, she's 6 at the moment, but she comes up to me, sees the sunshine outside, which is only like 5 minutes of sunshine that we're going to get here. And she says to me, Daddy, is it a good day for bike riding? Shall we go for a bike ride? And I'm running out to the webinar here. So I just had this awful feeling, like how to explain to her, because she's seen me working all week with the webinars. And you're right, it's that response in that moment where you're thinking, why are you asking me this question? Leave me alone. And, so you got to control yourself. I felt really bad for her, but hopefully once this webinar's over, I'll take some time out to ride the bike with her. But yeah, we can all relate to this, can't we, guys? As parents, we can relate to this. I always think that one way to understand why our mental health is really important before we go to our children, or how it has a knock-on effect on children, is in that scenario, the one that you just mentioned just now and before, is that when you're stressed out, the first thing that will come out is you shout at the child. And even though that may be an outburst for a couple of minutes, you might apologize. I just always wonder, what's the long-term impact of that few moments of madness?
Well, I think if it's just a few moments and it's not an oft repeated experience for the child, then inshallah, we should be okay. It's more if it's a consistent experience that they're having, I think. And so if we're apologizing and not changing our behavior, that's obviously going to have an impact, right?
Yeah, of course. Yes,
whereas if we continue the behavior, don't apologize, or do you apologize but keep behaving in that way, it will it will have an impact.
Okay.
So going back to anxiety, I guess it's really important to recognize that it's something that, again, is on that spectrum. We need a bit of anxiety because that's what allows us to be cautious and mindful and aware. We would otherwise cross the road without thinking if we didn't have a little bit of anxiety. And if we have too much of it, again, it doesn't allow us to get on with life, to move on, to live life, really. Yep.
I think you're right there, because if I've just put myself in the shoes of the job I do, or any teacher who's on here joining with us, anyone who's a content creator or a problem solver, you can see the correlation between a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of stress or pressure is good for you, because it activates that level of creativity in your head sometimes to problem solving. So that's how I relate to what you're saying. I don't know if it's the same thing, if pressure, absolutely, stress, anxiety, I mean, there's a question here from a sister, which was, what's the difference between stress and anxiety? Are they the same things or are they different?
So stress is the feeling of the pressure. Yeah. Yeah. And so it's more the feeling. So if you think of stress as the feeling that you're under threat.
Yeah.
And anxiety as the response to it, as to what's going on, the reaction. Okay.
Yep. That's great. We can move on.
That's the easiest way I can think of explaining it.
Brilliant. There are other questions. We will come on to them shortly. So are you okay here on this slide, or should
we can move on?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that brings us on to part 2 about the crisis in children and adults. And this is your slide here. Yep. I guess the question I had for this section from the audience was around, is there a mental health crisis amongst children and teenagers at school? So we've seen that. I mentioned it early on in terms of the statistics. There's lots of, by the way, there's lots of statistics and studies now being conducted and published. There's stats nearly, sort of lots of different types of stats if you look at them, but they're all pointing towards a crisis. So from your perspective, you already related to this, I guess, when you were at Tower Hamlets.
Yeah, and very much, and as you were saying, that it's not just working parents, it's working parents and non-working parents, but I don't like to think of them as not working parents because they are working, in different ways. Yeah. It's another job, parenting, a full-time job. So it's recognizing that, at the moment we are actually, because one of the interesting things is to recognize that I myself, as a practitioner, the person who's supposed to be supporting someone, can also be experiencing some of these things because of the excess stress, because the level of stress that everybody's been under as a consequence has been, of course, far more, right? If a lot of children have been at home, right, for the first lockdown and subsequent lockdowns, and parents had to be mum, dad, teacher. They had to be their own, whatever their roles were, working from home and having to all in that one space, right? And so there was no escape from those roles at any point. So no way of self-caring, no way of managing that. And so really people had to really think about how they did that. How do I get my 5 minutes of peace? How do I get my 30-minute walk without taking the kids with me? Or how do I do that?
Yeah, we all experience that. Yeah.
All right. So one of the things to share, and I think it's on the next slide, is another quote. And it's, what mental health needs is more sunlight, more candor, and more unashamed conversations, just like this.
Yes.
just to be able to talk about it and make it feel normal and natural, just as we have done about, as I said, about physical ailments. The more we talk about it, the less stigmatized it will feel, and people will feel able, inshallah, to seek the help that they need.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can relate to this. Times where there's been busy at work, or life is just getting tough. I've got 3 kids, alhamdulillah, rabbil alameen. I wouldn't have it any other way, mashallah. In fact, this is going to come on to one of the things we were talking about, where I actually often talk to my children about it, and I've got to be very careful when I'm talking to children about my feelings. And, for a 7-year-old, 6-year-old to even use the word stress and anxiety and, have those conversations with them, we'll come on to this, where the adult can actually move into parenting their children. And this is a very well-known concept, and perhaps many of us are guilty of this. We'll move on to that shortly, but I do believe what you're saying on this slide here, what Glenn Close has said in this quote, about there being more sunlight. In other words, when emphasis and exposure to it, and unashamed conversations. In other words, we're discussing this. I found these to be very, very helpful in my moments of low points. What about you guys? Has anybody else had the same thing? I mean, a simple conversation, a cup of tea, which we can't have right now, right? But
if you're fasting, yeah.
Yeah, if you're fasting, there's a walk, nature. There's so many things that, mashallah, are at our disposal, and we can have this. I guess one of the conversations that we're going to be having about the conversation is, when we get to the crisis point and management point, do people speak about this? And I'm jumping the gun here a bit. Are we more likely to have that conversation with people we know in our community? So, for example, now the imam at the masjid, sisters going to somebody at the mosque, or within the madrasa. I know from my research, because it's good to link this back to the research with the young people that we're doing at the moment, is that the vast majority of teenagers felt that they can't, well, I think it was, I can't remember, was it 1 in 3 or 2 in 3 children will not speak to the parents about it because of being judged, or the repercussions that come from opening up to their freedom. And then many of them wouldn't actually go to the school, teachers, because of the same issue. They feel like they would be labeled, and the stigma that goes with it, and the repercussions that come after it. And that's quite sad to hear. And many of them felt that the madrasas, they felt that actually out of the 3, the parent and the schools and the madrasa was the one that they would most likely like to go to, but there was a need for a lot of training and a lot of, changes in the madrasa for that to happen. But out of the 3, that's the one they felt. And that made me realize, and that's why I'm bringing it up here, where you mentioned unashamed conversation, is that where would people go to have that conversation? And is it quite easy to do that?
I think it depends on your local masjid and your local imam. As you're saying, are they trained up? Do they understand mental health? Do they know where to signpost people to? There's one. And similarly with the madrasas, I can understand why, youngsters would want to talk to somebody other than family and friends, because the adults do it too. And that's why counseling works and therapy works, because it's somebody who is completely separate, is in some ways a stranger, even though you may become very intimately sort of trusting of them, and build a really strong therapeutic alliance with that individual. There's something about talking to someone who doesn't have any buy-in in your life, if you like. They've got nothing to gain from listening to you and supporting you. And so, and also it's a non-judgmental space. It's very much about judgment. The reason why children and youngsters and adults as well struggle to talk about things is the fear of judgment. Yeah, and often there's shame related to these things. So whether it's trauma related from the past, or whether it's they're thinking that they are struggling with some sort of mental illness, the struggle is to sort of share that, because they might judge me, they might think I'm weak, all of the other misconceptions that we were talking about earlier. I mean, it's interesting that you shared the statistics. I mean, there's the Hidden Survivors report that
That's right. Yeah.
you and I have spoken about. And within that, as you said, 60% it says won't tell their parents that they're struggling.
That's right.
So that's in keeping with your 2/3.
2/3, yeah. That's right. Yeah, that's
and,
right.
And 4 in 5 of that in that report say that they are suffering with some sort of mental health struggle.
Right.
So it's really common. And then on top of that, our youngsters and our adults as well are also struggling with things like Islamophobia and racism. So they've got that as well. So it's a layered thing for our communities. We're not just experiencing the difficulty of a mental health struggle, but then it's layered because we're then experiencing, which heightens or worsens the struggle because we don't feel like there's people who will understand or listen to us within the mainstream, that is in particular.
Yeah, and there's some, I understand what you're saying. There's a question here which probably ties in nicely here with the managing the crisis or addressing the crisis. So the crisis that might be taking place right now with you as a parent. And there's another, this is one I was talking about earlier about my shouting or 5 minutes of outbursts with my children because I'm just firefighting in the moment, and my child opens the door and says, let's go for a cycle ride, or daddy, would you give me a moment? Let's, we've all had it, and there'll be a trigger point. And if you're not able to control your emotions, you shout. I've got better over the years, I'll admit, on this. And it's what you said about how you apologize and not repeat the behavior. There's a question here which is connected to what I was saying. Does a lot of mental health come from the parents not being able to connect to the child? So he then or she grows up and then repeats the process. This is the point about the long term, the cycle and the long term effect.
It can be. I don't want to play the blame game.
Yeah.
I don't think that's helpful. And in fact, that's very shaitanic if you look at the studies around what happens in terms of shaitan and how he manages his behavior and what he's done, and how our father and mother Adam and Hawa alayhi salam, how they respond, and they take responsibility. So that's really important. It's important for us to take responsibility, not to blame ourselves, not to blame our parents, it's important to recognize that, what can I do? What have I done? What's the change that I can make? Because if we take responsibility, the possibility of change is there. Yes, I think it's important to recognize what we are doing as parents, or what our parents may have done. And so what is the attachment style? So one of the things that we talk about in therapy and some of the modalities of therapy is how attached is an individual. So there's secure attachment and there's insecure attachment. The majority of us tend to be securely attached. And that's because our needs were met when we were babies and youngsters. What can happen and get in the way of that is not just, it's not always intentional. So what can create the insecure attachment? And there's different types of the insecure attachment, but not sure we're going to have time to go into all of that.
That's
today.
Fine.
And that's for another time. But I guess the thing is to recognize that perhaps our parents were ill, mentally or physically ill, and so they weren't able to give us and meet our needs. Perhaps, and it's trying to look at the bigger picture. So it's not to sort of say that they have no responsibility, but it's being able to forgive them for who they were, what they were at the time, and recognizing, but this is the impact of all of that on me.
Of course.
And what do I do with this impact? I am now an adult and I have the choice of what I do with this. And one of the things, and we'll talk about later on in terms of strategies, is looking at ourselves, healing first.
Yes, absolutely. So just because I'm conscious of time, I mean, there are questions. I think you just answered that one to Syra. Syra, your question was very similar to the one from the brother about the generation of our parents and how that's had a knock-on impact on us. And of course, we were talking about the previous question, which was about the knock-on effect of us on our children. So it's intergenerational, and we can relate to that. So that's good. And there's lots of other questions. There's some questions that have actually been put into the comment section, so please forgive me. I'm trying to jump between one forum to the other. There's another question here about a sister. In my work, I come across a fair number of school refusers due to high levels of anxiety, social anxiety, What are the best strategies and ways of supporting the child to access school education again? So we're talking about social anxiety here now.
Okay, so school refusal, that's a interesting one, and it can be for various reasons. One thing is to understand what's going on at home. Is the school refusal because they want to stay at home because they're worried about someone at home? So it could be because, and I've seen it often where parents have been ill, diagnosed with a significant terminal illness, and so they don't want to be apart from that parent in case something happens. If there's domestic abuse occurring within the home, or there's been arguments, regular arguments, and there's a feeling of that the family might split. I mean, even in teenagers, this can happen where there's school refusal because of that. So it's really important to understand what's the system around the child, what's creating that. And the best way and most important thing to do in school is to develop those relationships with the children. So by building the relationship, because it's the relationship that helps. So if there's an insecure attachment, through a new relationship within the school or elsewhere, it just takes one other adult to create that. If you think about sort of, I think it's Mo Farah, who had his coach take an interest in him, and that changed his whole life. And he's a runner, and he said, I think he could have been sort of on drugs and things otherwise.
That's right. Yeah.
So it really just takes one of us to take that interest in a child. And so by building the relationship, we can, through the relationship, help them see that there's different ways of being, and that can alleviate the anxiety. But it's really important to recognize first what's going on. So what is the anxiety around? Is it the anxiety? Is it to do with sort of being in crowds? So is it a social anxiety? How do we know that it's a social anxiety as opposed to anxiety around what's going on at home, what's left behind at home? So it's really important to clarify what it is, first of all, and then work in that way. But one of the things that I recommend to schools is to work with the child and have like a limited number of children that they will, adults, not children, limited number of adults that will be sort of the team around that child, so that they're not overwhelmed by the number of relationships and not know where to go, and really try and create structure and things around that child.
I've had a look at the questions in the question bank. Thank you so much for those who've sent them to the question bank, and also for the comments and the questions in the comment section. Some of the questions in the Q&A are quite heavy, and they deserve time to be answered. And what I don't want to do is start something now and then have to fast forward because of time. So what we'll do is we'll take them in shortly at the end of this webinar, if that's okay with the questioners. Sister Calder, we might just run over from 4:15, but if I let you carry on with your slides and get to a point where we can take the Q&A, and those who want to stay for the Q&A can stay, and those who need to leave can leave on time, inshallah. Is that okay?
That's fine by me. I can just mention, so I was just going to talk about a little bit about the impact of COVID.
Yeah.
19 on things. So there's a report by the Lantern Initiative.
Yes.
And
okay,
I'll talk about this in a moment too, in terms of the mental health crisis.
Sorry, I'll take that. I'll take that off the slide. Do you want to keep that on? Yep.
But in terms of there's actually what's been come forward from that is that there's a mixture of feelings in terms of the impact. So there's positive impacts and negative impacts as a result of COVID-19. And one of the things I've noticed is those who have high anxiety, so my clients who have OCD, some of them, they've actually done better in COVID-19 and the lockdowns in particular, not the sort of after. Now they're sort of struggling a bit more, but it's more when the lockdowns were occurring, they were doing better because they didn't have to go out and deal. And so also with social anxiety, so as that's been mentioned, not having to interact with people, not having to deal with people. So one of the positives is that there was increased time for self-reflection, time to spend with family, and there's increased time to pursue personal interests. That was the positive impacts of COVID-19. The negative is that there was an increased sense of isolation and loneliness.
Yes, I read this, yes.
Stress and anxiety, sadness, depression and grief. And that's the thing, we all went through and have been going through and are still probably going through a collective grief in relation to COVID-19. So that's really important to recognize that sometimes we're not aware of what we're feeling. We notice that we're feeling something, as I said, that we recognize the body sensations, but it's only after somebody said it or we've read something that might sort of link it to, actually, I'm going through a severe bout of depression here, perhaps, or grief.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, next slide. Would you want to move on?
Yeah, we can do.
Okay. This was this is the BBC report last year, wasn't it? That we all, I think most of us read this, where we saw the increase from 2017 to 2021, and it's gone higher now. So in terms of the cases amongst young people, you can see that the spike coming, the reversal going back up again. And then these issues on the right-hand side is what staff members, teachers, from, I think it was 1,130 teaching and sports staff, they conducted a survey just 2 months ago on the issues around amongst young people. Anxiety is right up there, so it's almost like 50%. It was actually mainly to do with anxiety, attention difficulties, low self-esteem. These are the things which correlate with my research, my own research, independent of this study. In fact, most of those things, self-harm, suicidal thoughts was in there, eating difficulties, disorders, being depressed or withdrawn. A lot of this we know. If you work with children, either your own or you work with children outside into the community in the schools, you'll see a lot of this. It should not be something new to you.
Yeah, I would agree there anecdotally again, in terms of what I was seeing during the pandemic and pre-pandemic. It was on the increase anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
But it was just like exponential jump. Once as a sort of pandemic kicked in, and the suicidal thoughts in particular, and self-harm amongst, because the bullying seemed to be increasing, and online bullying.
That's right.
During this time, I think has increased. So that's that's an impact. And how do we do that? How do we manage that? And I think it's really important to look at, are our children the bullies? And that's important to work on. I'm not saying, because I don't know if you saw, a while ago, it was a video, and it's in America. They often come from America, these videos, but a child had been sort of bullying another child in America, and the parent made the child, like, they drove along, but the child had to walk to school, and so basically was bullying the child, really. And I don't think that's the answer either. So that might explain why the child was bullying in the first place. But yes, I think it's really important to look at, what is it that's causing, what am I doing at home? What is going on? Sometimes it's not necessarily that they're being bullied at home or experiencing bullying. It might be actually attention needing. We talk about it as attention needing behavior.
Yeah, of course.
And so,
sorry to interrupt there. One of the things that I'm actually dealing with at the moment now with a few schools, and this is really common, and this is a global problem, is that what's the difference between boisterous play? So boys just, young boys in my son's age group, just playing, and they're fighting or they're playing, but they're actually just playing. And what's the difference between that and then how do you define bullying, and where does that start and where does that end? So this is a common problem. I mean, I guess we're probably going to need a full-on session just in terms of what is bullying and classed as bullying, and how do you deal with that?
It's around the intent, isn't it?
Yeah.
I guess, what is the intent of the behavior and the action? And sometimes, even though it's not meant to hurt, it does hurt. So
it does hurt,
it's being able to talk about these things and seeing these things as, and you were mentioning earlier, and I had the idea, and I didn't sort of mention it at the time, but seeing things not necessarily as mistakes.
Yes.
So, shouting at a child, it's not a mistake. It's happened. It's a learning opportunity, right? It's both a learning opportunity for yourself, but it's also a teaching opportunity in terms of teaching to the child, right?
Yeah, of course.
Being able to see those, and that having that growth mindset that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. On the sorry, just stay focused on the Q&As. We're just getting more questions coming through, which is great. It's fantastic. It's just taking a bit of time to warm up to get the questions out as the session is coming towards the end. I won't stop you from there. So do you want to move on to the next next point? Alhamdulillah. All right. This was something that we can move on from here. Now, this is something I mentioned earlier about, parenting flying. I don't know if you want to touch upon this, and it'll be worth this might be common, where we are not in control of ourselves sometimes, or we are in need of support, and we end up, leaning on the child. And what impact does that have? So maybe some thoughts here would be good.
Well, it's a interesting term, this parentification of children. So children being seen as adults or more parent than actually, well, children shouldn't be parents, really, should they?
No, no.
At all. But I guess they can, at an older age, perhaps if they're teenagers, but it's not sort of starting from the beginning, not starting when they're 5 years old or younger. And it's really important that to recognize when we're doing it. So are we pulling our children into adult arguments and conversations? So maybe you're having an argument with your spouse and you're saying to the child, don't take your father's side, or or you're saying, what do you think? Your father's doing this or your mother's doing this. So it's important not to pull them in and not to see them as an adult. And so sometimes what we do is, we might be single because we're single parents, or the other parent and spouse is absent in many ways, and so you don't have someone to speak to. And so often the oldest child, you'll see this often in the eldest child. It's not so much in sort of younger children, but it's the oldest child that often gets parentified.
Absolutely.
And so,
I've seen this, yeah.
how to recognize that that's going on in you. So if you grow up feeling responsible, you're often very compliant. If you've been parentified, it's the child that says, or even the adult that says yes to everything.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I've seen this. Yes.
The people pleaser. So that's that's how we can recognize that perhaps we've been parentified ourselves.
So just to clarify that, is that, so what we saying that people please, when you see a sign of someone who's a people pleaser, is that a sign that they've been parentified? Did I understand?
Yeah, often that's the case, that or they've been sort of a lot of guilt and shame, and as you can see, it says at the bottom, it's a child you felt guilt and shame. Sorry, excuse me. So what was I going to say there? I was just going to say that in terms of the guilt and shame, so emotional blackmail, that's a parenting tool, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. We all know this one.
Yeah, I'm sure as as children, you may have experienced it. You don't necessarily do this, as that the impact of the emotional blackmail on the child, but it really does bring up guilt and shame, because so for instance, if you don't love me, you would do this. If you loved me, you would do this thing. It's because you don't love me, you're doing that. Right? And so what does that do to the inside? So it's really, it just makes you feel bad and horrible, really. And so, and then what you want to do is be really good. And so then you say yes to everything. Yeah, you sort of fulfill everyone's needs because you don't want to feel that feeling. And so that's why the people pleasing occurs.
Okay.
So any number of these things that are up on the screen can happen. And so ways to sort of break the cycle for yourself is to recognize that you are not responsible for everybody else. I've had clients where when we're talking and things, it's like, it sounds like you're responsible for everyone in the world.
It does sometimes feel like that.
Yeah, and so we really explore that, and it's like, oh gosh, I do feel like that. It feels really heavy, and then we break it down. But it's really being able to recognize that we are not the family peacekeeper. It's not our responsibility to keep the peace. And really, there's a lot of inner child work that needs to happen when somebody's being parentified. It's really getting to know the child within them, and acknowledging the child within them and working through that. And that would be in therapy. It's hard to do that on your own in terms of reconnecting with your inner child, but there are ways of doing it. Really reconnecting with playfulness and fun, because as a child, you've not been able to have a childhood often if you've been parentified. And so that's why it's really important to implement the 7-7-7. I'm sure you've discussed this before, but really letting our children be children.
On the 7-7-7, it's based on the advice of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu. We've heard about it, play, and then you become the friend after 7. We have touched upon it in the last session and the previous session. We will be touching upon it in the coming sessions. We're looking at clubs and looking at madrasas and schools and education. But because I'm just conscious of time, Sister Khalda, I mean, we always run out of time on these really important points. I just want to mention one thing about men and mental health. there is a big taboo. And again, this is something that I as being a man, I know it's very difficult to get this off our chest, and the shame that comes around it, mental health and taboos around it. So there is something that Mind have put together. I don't know if you've had a chance to read this, but get off your chest, Men's Mental Health 10 Years On. It's worth having a look at this. This was shared to me by Imam Abdullah Hassan from the the British Board of Scholars and Imams, BBSI.
Yep.
It's worth having a look at that. And then, I mean, we've kind of almost run out of time. We've kind of discussed this along the way. I guess I feel like we were just discussing this before. Yeah, even though the slides are not matching the conversation, we are. We've spoken about this, haven't we? We've come to 4:15, so we've spoken about this. And what I would like to do here, because of time and people may need to leave, those of you who've asked questions in the Q&A, please stick around. Myself and Sister Calder, we're still going to stick around here and try our best to answer some of those questions. In terms of the rest of us who are maybe on a timer, these are sort of signposting you towards accessing mental health support. So Sister Khalda, if you could just maybe elaborate on some of the remaining few slides about this initiative, mashallah, which is a fantastic initiative that's been launched very recently, and where can people go for help?
Yeah, and it's very new. So in terms of actually anything being available directly to the public, yeah, it's not there. But just to let you know that there are things in development. And one of the areas that Muslim Mind Collaborative are working on is actually educating the mainstream. So mainstream practitioners and services around how to work with Muslims. I don't know who's seen a therapist in the mainstream and who's not, but one of the anecdotes that often is heard by a Muslim therapist is, "I'm so glad I found you." It's been really difficult working with someone who really doesn't understand. I can't say, like, I need to pray 5 times a day, but I'm not, and they don't understand why it creates so much guilt and shame in me, that kind of thing. So it's really important to be able to have this collaborative, and it's been many years in the process of being developed, but we are looking to create work and then services as well in a collaborative way. So there are a huge number, and it's a growing number of organizations that are faith-based and faith-sensitive. I mean, as mentioned in my bio earlier, I work with Noor Domestic Violence, and they've been around for about 10 years now, and we've had counseling services there, and it's very much faith-sensitive and faith-oriented.
Fantastic. Okay. So that's one, mashallah, which I'm also part of, and attended the meeting. I thought it was really good that we're starting to collaborate, which is really important. This is something, again, that was shared by the BBSI, the British Board of Scholars and Imams. This is a toolkit which has been prepared with a lot of work with imams and the madrasas and schools. So if you are part of an institute, it's worth downloading that and having a look. I mean, if my able colleague can put that into the chat, that'd be fantastic, the link. So there's mental health toolkit, and there are many, I believe I've heard there's many other resources that are being put together now, mashallah, by the board. Anything else? I mean, if you want to...
And you've also, I think you were saying that you've put together some toolkits and things as well.
Resources, yeah.
So there's that. And the other thing I would say is work with professionals, talk to, get their input. So if you want to sort of set up something, or you want to create that thread through the madrasa or the school, wherever you're working, it's really important to work with individuals who understand what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Zara, if you want to put the link to our store in there, so there's a free download in terms of the resources. So if you're thinking about how to raise your awareness of mental health and well-being with your children or your family through educational sort of ways in terms of resources and how you can start a conversation, have a lesson around it. There's some fantastic resources which Zahra, mashallah, is the author, has put together, and these were downloaded in 81 countries, several thousand times during the pandemic. So when we took out resources and made them accessible to parents at the peak of the pandemic, the feedback on this has been fantastic. And these are just some of the resources that you can actually get the ball rolling, very easy to implement. And that's what we're here for. The purpose of the outcome or the output of this investment of time is that you can be informed, but also you got tools to transform yourself through practice and implementation.
That's it. And we have to start with ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But also the other thing is really creating those safe spaces for people
Yes.
to be able to
Yep.
attend and speak and learn.
Absolutely. And there's many more, inshallah, this is the start, and there's many, we're not starting, there's many people who started this, and the ball's rolling, and we've all got to contribute in some form or the other. And the more we interact, the more we learn about the problems and the issues and the diversity, and each other, I guess. It's having, like you said, the platform and, you know, the access and the courage and not the stigma around it, to be able to come and in safe open space and learn that. It's been very beneficial, like I said, personally to me. And I think this was one of the reasons that this webinar was really important, following on from the identity crisis one, because at the heart of it, it's really about mental and emotional well-being, which we'll come on to tomorrow. Just before I go on to the, just before I actually go on to the final slides about what's happening this week and where we follow on from here as part of the series. Sister Khalda, is there anything, I mean, first things, folks, if you guys want to summarize, I don't usually like to spoon feed you, so if you want to summarize some of the key takeaway points that you've taken from this webinar, drop them in the chat, inshallah. It'll be good for us to get some sort of evaluation. And but Sister Khalda, from your perspective, any last closing comments from you on this particular topic?
I'd just like to really say thank you all for being here and listening to whatever it is that I've shared, and I pray that it was of value, and obviously any mistakes are my own. So please, yeah, forgive me on any mistakes that I may have made.
Brilliant, and thank you so much for your contribution, and I mean, you responded at the drop of a hat to this, so very, very grateful to you as always, inshallah. Hopefully, for those of you who've been with us on the events and the retreats, why don't you just take a couple of seconds to tell us a little bit more about the sleepover if you want, and you know, where can people access that? Where can the sisters actually access that event?
Well, we've been running it for it would have been 5 years come 2020, but then the 2021 didn't happen because of the pandemic. So we began in Morocco, and inshallah this year we will return to Morocco, but it will be a slightly different vibe, in that it will probably be a desert retreat rather than somewhere just outside Marrakesh is where we used to do that. And it includes some what we call in-breath moments and some out-breath moments. So in-breath moments are things where you're really thinking and it's all heady and cognitive. So things like we have visualizations and groups where we think and talk about what comes up from the visualization. And we look at, as I said earlier, so fitra and the self, we look at sisterhood, and we look at our relationship with our sustainer. And we try and, it comes up, different things come up for different people, but alhamdulillah, we've had really positive responses from people, and we have a bit of a sisterhood. So you then join our WhatsApp group, and then, you know, we have people from all across the world that come, sisters who come from all across the world, and they really valued the space. And the out-breath moments are things like nice pamper sessions. You get to go on a hike and into nature. We also do a bit of shopping, which we know we have to do.
Retail therapy,
a bit of retail therapy. Yeah, I know some brothers enjoy that just as much as sisters. So.
Brothers, if there's any brothers who are listening to this and they're on here, I don't know if, Rahil, are you here? If any of the brothers who are basically on here, I think we can't really say we're jealous, but, you know, I think it's about time we did something very similar. So please get in touch, and we need a boys version of this. But thank you so much to the comment made by a familiar sister, mashallah, who I've met from the retreat, I think it is. Thank you. She said, this has been such a beneficial talk. Jazakallahu khair. Bless you, sister, for making that comment, alhamdulillah. And as you were talking about the retreat and you mentioned Morocco and you'll be doing another one, I just knew in the back of my head that I'm going to get a message any minute now on my phone, and ping, the message came from my good wife. She said, I'm going to Morocco. So I just want to ask, how long is this retreat? Because I'm going to have to arrange childcare now. I'm going to have to put that into my budget.
It's a week, and absolutely, I think it's good for fathering time.
Of course it is. We've done this before. Honestly, I think on that point, she did one recently, and I really encourage mums and sisters to do this, and especially the husbands who are listening to this. Please take time out to encourage your good wives and your sisters and mothers. Let them go away for a weekend with sisters. This one was to the Lake District, and I had my children for 3 days. And all I can say to you is this, is that the tarbiyah that my wife got was different to what we got at home. But the main thing was the whole unit without mum was, I was gonna say amazing, but amazing in a different way, where I connected with my children as a dad at home, stay-at-home dad, in ways that I've never connected whilst in her presence. And the heart grows fonder, you know, a distance makes the heart grow fonder. The children, I've never seen my children actually cry for their mum on the drive from dropping her off and coming back from the lakes as much as I did. And it's like what you said, it might, a little bit of anxiety and a little bit of, it's good for that, it's good for, if it's managed and channeled properly.
That's it. And challenge, we are supposed to experience challenge, and it's important for children to experience challenge. Because that's what builds resilience. That builds that sort of, you know, I think we were talking about separately about that character building.
Character building, yeah.
And we need that. If we don't experience any challenge in our lives, then yeah, it's really hard to grow up not feeling entitled.
For those of you who are familiar with the Ilm Channel retreats in the summer, the family retreats that we do, inshallah, I hope to see you again this summer. We will be hopefully inviting, and she will join us, inshallah. She was meant to come last year, actually. She will, Sister Khalda will, inshallah, be on the next retreat. I will make sure she's got no weddings planned on that weekend. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it last time. There's a question, when is the next one? Looking forward to it, alhamdulillah. Thank you, sister. Inshallah, once the webinars are coming to an end, we'll start planning the retreat. We're probably looking at the same time in August again, inshallah. So yeah, keep a lookout for that. And any other last things you want to say before I move on to tomorrow's event, which is connected to this one?
I was just going to say that my email address, I know, was put up earlier, but someone could put it in the chat. Then I'm happy to, you know, for people to contact me directly. I know somebody was asking me to contact them. I think I saw in the chat.
Yeah, you can.
They're still around. If they take note of my email and contact me, that would be easier.
Can you just repeat your email now so that I can't get a visual on it? So if you can just repeat your email now, that would be really good.
Khalida, so KHALIDA.H@hotmail.co.uk.
So it's Khalida. Go on then, say it again. Sorry,
Khalida.H.
Khalida.H@hotmail.co.uk. Correct. Khalida.H@hotmail.co.uk, folks. There you go. You can keep in touch with her, inshallah. It'll be fantastic. And you can access her directly and email, and inshallah she will do her best to get back to you. I'm just going to finish up on these 2 slides, and then we can take some Q&A from the people who are waiting. Thank you once again for your patience. Tomorrow's webinar, inshallah, is going to be a cracking one. On personality types, love languages. It's around emotional well-being, but more so about emotional intelligence. And I think one of the things that Sister Khalda alluded to in the webinar was about getting to know your children and the inner child. And part of that, to do that, you've got to be able to know how to work yourself out. And if you have the practice on yourself in terms of the way Allah has wired you, in terms of your personalities, what's your love languages, all of these kind of things are really important in trying to understand our DNA from a personality perspective. So without operating on yourself or anyone else, understanding the DNA of your personality type. And it'll be quite fun, insightful, informative, inshallah, tomorrow. Please, please, please try to come attend. Same time again, 3 o'clock tomorrow. We've got Sister Maryam Javed, mashallah, who's a parent coach, and she's very experienced in this area, mashallah. So it'll be a really good conversation to have, and it follows on nicely from this conversation around mental health. The two, I believe, as someone, you know, as a father, as a director of an organization and working in education, these 2 things about understanding mental health, the triggers, the issues, the remedies, the conversations, the important impact, the science of that, along with the emotional intelligence tools, the personality testing, the love languages. If we are able to, as parents and teachers, able to just understand each child where they're at and meet them where they're at, in terms of the way they are, who they are, and the way they tick inside. If we're able to do that with this little bit of training, honestly, half of our problems that we experience as adults, who are trying to control or manage children in terms of behavior or their progress and development, half of the challenges that we have, the impediments that we have in terms of their growth and them cooperating, will vanish. They'll go at bay. You get them. And I've seen this in my own house. My children are here. You can speak to them if you want to. And in the classroom, I always take a couple of weeks just to do the groundwork in trying to understand each child where they're at, whether it's at the workplace, trying to understand the employees or my colleagues, where they're at, just trying to understand where they're at and then meet them where they are and then take them to where you want them to go. And I think these two sciences, mental health and personality testing or psychoanalysis, part of psychoanalysis, it's really important for us as change makers or nurturing the change makers that we understand that. So tomorrow we are at 3 o'clock. Please invite as many people as you can, bring yourself as well. And then we have 2 other webinars next week, one on Wednesday and the other one on Saturday. We have Ustad Idris Khamisa from South Africa, who's an international human development coach. My Ustad joining us, trying to look at, as a follow-on from tomorrow's session, which is about parental leadership styles. So that'll be really important to touch upon the work of Dr. Diana Borrimann's 4 styles. So that would be really good for you to join that and understand as you know, how to put your leadership into practice and what style works best for your child. And last but not least, there's another webinar. There's 2 more actually. Next Saturday, we're going to be looking at curricular clubs that your children will need before adulthood. And this is all part of it. That'll be, I guess, in terms of social, cultural skills development. And that brings us on to the last slide. Please get in touch on the details there if you need to get in touch and ask questions. If there's anything that you're unsure about, there will be a common question about links to the webinars and recordings. Don't worry, inshallah, we're going to try our very, very best. If I don't botch up the recording, we're going to try to make a rich resource or a suite of resources, a library of video content that we should, inshallah, share with you for anyone who's registered. So this is why it's really important to register. We'll share it with you. So it's there, it's free, inshallah. It's our Sadaqah Jariyah and it's support for the community during this blessed month of Ramadan, inshallah. I've gone over time. Thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in. And if you need to leave, you can do. There is a hand raise, which I will take as part of the Q&A, which Sister Khalda has generously donated a time to say she will stay on. So please, from myself and the team at Amal, we'll see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Thank you so much to everybody who's participated. Thank you for your comments and questions and for the generous support that you always give outside of the webinars, whether that's a comment or whether that's a question or anything else that you do for us. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Take care of yourself and make sure you have a good, nice cup of tea or a coffee with some chocolate later on this evening. Just take care of yourself. Self-care is really important. I guess that's the best thing we can take from
Absolutely.
here. Barakallah feek. Take care, guys. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.